October 23, 1942. The desert air above El Alamein shimmered with heat as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood atop his command vehicle, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. The legendary Desert Fox had just witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft filling the Egyptian sky, their engines drowning out the sound of his retreating Africa Corps. Just 18 months earlier, this same man had dismissed American industrial promises as the desperate boasting of a nation unprepared for modern warfare. When President Roosevelt announced America's intention to build 50,000 fighter aircraft annually, Rommel had reportedly laughed at the intelligence briefing. "The Americans," he had told his staff officers, "understand publicity better than they understand production. 50,000 fighters. They might as well promise us the moon." Now, as British Spitfires and American-built Kitty Hawks strafed his columns with impunity, Rommel was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The Desert Fox, who had earned his reputation through tactical brilliance and an uncanny ability to read his opponents, had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American industrial power. But this was only the beginning of his education. By the time the war ended, America wouldn't just build 50,000 fighters. It would produce over 100,000, fundamentally altering the balance of air power and contributing to the defeat of the very forces Rommel commanded. The mockery of 1941 would become the nightmare of 1943, as American factories transformed Roosevelt's seemingly impossible promise into the harsh reality of overwhelming Allied air superiority. To understand how spectacularly wrong Rommel's assessment would prove to be, we must first understand the world as it existed in early 1941. Erwin Rommel was at the height of his fame, having just arrived in North Africa to command what would become the legendary Africa Corps. His reputation had been forged in the lightning campaigns of 1940, where his 7th Panzer Division had earned the nickname Ghost Division for its rapid advances through France. Rommel represented everything that made the German military formidable in the early war years: tactical innovation, aggressive leadership, and an intimate understanding of combined arms warfare. He had studied American military capabilities during the interwar period and, like many German officers, had concluded that American strength lay in industrial potential rather than military readiness. This assessment wasn't entirely unreasonable. In 1940, the United States Army Air Corps operated fewer than 3,000 combat aircraft, many of them obsolete by European standards. American fighter production that year totaled just 2,141 aircraft, a number that seemed laughably small compared to German output of over 10,000 military aircraft annually. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress on May 16, 1940, calling for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year, the announcement sent shockwaves around the world. To put this in perspective, the entire German aircraft industry, after years of rearmament under the Nazi regime, was producing approximately 10,000 aircraft annually. Roosevelt was proposing that America alone would produce 5 times Germany's total output. The German High Command's reaction was swift and dismissive. Intelligence reports filed in Berlin characterized Roosevelt's announcement as typical American propaganda, designed to boost morale and intimidate Germany's allies. The consensus among German military analysts was clear. The Americans were engaging in wishful thinking on a scale that bordered on fantasy. Rommel, studying these intelligence assessments in his headquarters, shared this skepticism. His experience with American equipment during World War I had been limited, but he understood industrial warfare. Building aircraft wasn't like manufacturing automobiles. It required precision engineering, skilled craftsmen, and complex supply chains. The idea that a nation with minimal recent combat experience could suddenly become the world's largest aircraft producer seemed to defy logic. Moreover, Rommel understood the mathematics of modern warfare. Germany had spent years building its aircraft industry, investing heavily in research, development, and production facilities. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, widely regarded as one of the world's finest fighters, was the product of years of refinement and testing. How could American industry, starting virtually from scratch, hope to match German quality while achieving impossible quantities? What Rommel and other German leaders failed to fully appreciate was the unique nature of American industrial capacity. The United States in 1940 possessed something that no other nation could match: a vast, technologically advanced industrial base that was operating far below its potential capacity due to the lingering effects of the Great Depression. American automobile manufacturers alone produced over 4 million vehicles annually, more than the rest of the world combined. Companies like General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler had perfected mass production techniques that could potentially be adapted to aircraft manufacturing. The same assembly lines that produced cars could, with modification, produce aircraft engines, components, and even complete airframes. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was organizational and cultural. American industry would need to transform itself from a peacetime economy focused on consumer goods to a wartime economy dedicated to military production. This transformation would require unprecedented cooperation between government and industry, between competing companies, and between labor and management. The process began even before Pearl Harbor, as the Lend-Lease program created demand for American-built aircraft to support Britain and other allies. Companies like Curtiss-Wright, North American Aviation, and Lockheed began expanding their production facilities and workforce. But the real transformation would come only after December 7, 1941, when America's entry into the war made aircraft production a matter of national survival. From Rommel's perspective in North Africa, American boasts about aircraft production seemed increasingly irrelevant to the immediate tactical situation. The Desert Fox was fighting a war of movement and maneuver, where the quality of equipment and the skill of operators mattered more than raw numbers. His Afrika Korps had repeatedly defeated larger British forces through superior tactics and battlefield innovation. The aircraft that Rommel encountered in North Africa during 1941 and early 1942 seemed to confirm his skepticism about American industrial capabilities. British forces were equipped with a mixture of aircraft, many of them obsolete or inferior to their German counterparts. The Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, an American-built fighter supplied to the Royal Air Force, was outclassed by the Messerschmitt Bf-109 in most performance categories. Rommel's pilots reported that American-built aircraft, while numerous, lacked the sophistication and performance of German designs. The P-40 was heavy, slow to climb, and vulnerable in dogfights against experienced Luftwaffe pilots. If this was the best that American industry could produce, Rommel reasoned, then quantity alone would not be enough to change the strategic balance. This assessment was reinforced by intelligence reports from other theaters. German forces in the Soviet Union reported encountering American-built aircraft supplied under Lend-Lease, but these encounters had not significantly altered the tactical situation on the Eastern Front. American aircraft seemed adequate for secondary roles, but inferior to German designs in air-to-air combat. What Rommel couldn't see from his desert headquarters was the transformation taking place in American factories. The P-40 Tomahawk that his pilots were encountering in 1942 had been designed in 1938, before American industry had fully mobilized for war production. By the time these aircraft reached North Africa, American designers were already working on fighters that would prove superior to anything in the German arsenal. While Rommel was winning tactical victories in the desert, a revolution was taking place in American factories that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war. The transformation began with existing aircraft manufacturers, but quickly spread to companies that had never built aircraft before. General Motors, the world's largest automobile manufacturer, converted entire production lines to aircraft engine manufacturing. The company's experience with precision machining and mass production proved invaluable in producing the Allison V-1710 engine that powered many American fighters. By 1943, GM was producing more aircraft engines than the entire German aircraft industry. Ford Motor Company undertook an even more ambitious project, building an entire factory dedicated to producing B-24 Liberator bombers. The Willow Run plant in Michigan became a symbol of American industrial might, employing over 40,000 workers and producing one 4-engine bomber every hour at peak production. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening in companies that specialized in fighter aircraft. North American Aviation, a relatively small company before the war, became one of the world's largest aircraft manufacturers. Their P-51 Mustang, initially designed to meet a British requirement, would eventually become the finest fighter aircraft of the war. The human element of this transformation was equally remarkable. Aircraft production required skilled workers, but America's pre-war aircraft industry employed fewer than 64,000 people. By 1943, over 2.1 million Americans were working in aircraft factories. Many of these workers were women, entering industrial employment for the first time in their lives. Others were minorities who had been excluded from high-paying industrial jobs before the war. Training programs were established that could take someone with no mechanical experience and turn them into a skilled aircraft assembler in a matter of weeks. The speed of this workforce development was unprecedented in industrial history, made possible by simplified manufacturing processes and innovative training techniques. By late 1942, the first clear evidence of American industrial mobilization was becoming apparent in combat theaters around the world. The numbers were starting to tell a story that contradicted everything Rommel had believed about American production capabilities. In 1942, American factories produced 47,136 aircraft, nearly achieving Roosevelt's seemingly impossible goal of 50,000 per year. This included 10,769 fighters, a number that exceeded total German fighter production for the same period. But this was just the beginning of America's industrial acceleration. The quality gap that had initially favored German aircraft was also beginning to close. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design and heavy armament, was proving effective against German fighters in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive fighter bomber that could absorb tremendous damage and still return home, was beginning to appear in significant numbers. Most significantly, the P-51 Mustang was entering production in quantities that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. When equipped with the British-designed Merlin engine, the Mustang became arguably the finest fighter aircraft of the war, combining long-range, high performance, and excellent maneuverability. But it wasn't just the aircraft themselves that were impressive. It was the entire industrial ecosystem that supported them. American factories were producing engines, radios, navigation equipment, and weapon systems in quantities that allowed for rapid innovation and improvement. The same production lines that had struggled to build a few hundred aircraft engines in 1940 were delivering thousands of increasingly powerful and reliable engines by 1943. The first clear demonstration of American industrial power in Rommel's theater came during the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. British forces, now equipped with significant numbers of American-built aircraft and supported by American pilots flying P-40 Warhawks, achieved air superiority over the battlefield for the first time since Rommel's arrival in North Africa. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and profound. Luftwaffe pilots who had dominated North African skies since 1941 suddenly found themselves outnumbered and increasingly outgunned. The quality advantage that German aircraft had enjoyed was being eroded by both improved Allied aircraft and the simple mathematics of attrition. Rommel himself witnessed this transformation firsthand during his retreat from El Alamein. Allied aircraft attacked his columns continuously, forcing the Afrika Korps to move only at night and seek cover during daylight hours. The tactical mobility that had been Rommel's greatest asset was being neutralized by Allied air power. In his diary, Rommel wrote, "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There's simply no answer to it. Our air force is far too weak." This was a remarkable admission from a commander who had built his reputation on finding tactical solutions to strategic problems. The intelligence reports reaching Rommel's headquarters painted an increasingly grim picture. American aircraft production was not only meeting Roosevelt's ambitious goals, but appeared to be accelerating beyond them. More troubling still, the quality of American aircraft was improving rapidly, suggesting that American industry was not just producing more aircraft, but better aircraft. What made American aircraft production so devastating to German hopes wasn't just the raw numbers. It was the compound effect of sustained high-level production. Every month, American factories delivered thousands of new aircraft to training bases, where newly graduated pilots learned to fly them before shipping out to combat zones. This created a virtuous cycle that German planners had failed to anticipate. More aircraft meant more pilots could be trained simultaneously. More pilots meant that combat losses could be replaced more quickly. More replacement pilots meant that experienced aviators could be rotated home to serve as instructors, improving the quality of training for the next generation of pilots. Germany, by contrast, was caught in a vicious cycle of declining capability. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with superbly trained pilots, many of whom had gained experience during the Spanish Civil War. But these experienced aviators were irreplaceable when lost in combat. German pilot training programs, while maintaining quality, could not be expanded rapidly enough to replace combat losses. The mathematical reality was becoming clear to those German leaders willing to acknowledge it. Even if German pilots maintained their initial qualitative advantage, which was becoming increasingly doubtful as Allied pilots gained experience, they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Rommel, studying the intelligence reports flowing into his headquarters, began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The 50,000 aircraft that had seemed like American fantasy in 1940 were becoming reality in 1942. Worse still, there were indications that American production was continuing to accelerate, with no apparent ceiling in sight. Behind the impressive production statistics were millions of individual stories of sacrifice and transformation. The men and women who built America's air armada worked under conditions that would be unthinkable today. Factories operated around the clock, with workers pulling 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. Margaret Thompson, a former schoolteacher who became a riveter at the Consolidated Aircraft plant in San Diego, later recalled the intensity of those years. "We knew that every plane we built might save American lives somewhere in North Africa or Europe. That knowledge kept us going when our hands were bleeding from the rivets and our backs ached from bending over the assembly line for hours at a time." The social transformation was equally profound. Entire communities sprang up around aircraft plants, often in locations that had been farmland just months before. These boom towns struggled to provide housing, schools, and basic services for the influx of workers. Families lived in trailers, converted barns, and hastily constructed dormitories. For many workers, especially women and minorities who had been excluded from high-paying industrial jobs before the war, aircraft production offered unprecedented opportunities. African Americans migrated from the rural South to work in aircraft plants in California, Michigan, and other industrial centers. Women discovered they could operate complex machinery and earn wages that had previously been reserved for men. But the pressure was relentless. Production quotas were constantly increased, and any slowdown in the assembly line was seen as a potential threat to American servicemen fighting overseas. Workers were bombarded with propaganda reminding them that production wins wars, and that every minute of delay could cost lives in North Africa, Europe, or the Pacific. As 1942 drew to a close, the strategic implications of American aircraft production were becoming clear to military leaders on both sides of the conflict. The United States was not just meeting its ambitious production goals, it was exceeding them while simultaneously improving the quality and capability of its aircraft. For the Allies, this meant that air superiority, which had been a German advantage since the beginning of the war, was shifting decisively in their favor. The ability to conduct strategic bombing campaigns, support ground operations, and protect supply lines was being transformed by the sheer volume of aircraft rolling off American production lines. For Germany, the implications were far more ominous. The Luftwaffe, which had been the world's most powerful air force in 1939, was being overwhelmed not by superior technology or tactics, but by the simple mathematics of industrial production. German aircraft factories, operating at maximum capacity, could not match the output of American industry operating at even partial capacity. Rommel, now retreating across North Africa with the remnants of his Africa Corps, was witnessing this transformation firsthand. The desert fox who had mocked American industrial promises was learning that in modern warfare, production capacity was as important as tactical skill. The Battle of El Alamein marked more than just a tactical defeat for Rommel. It represented the moment when American industrial power began to decisively influence the outcome of the war. The aircraft that filled the skies above the Egyptian desert were tangible proof that Roosevelt's seemingly impossible promises were becoming reality. But this was only the beginning. As 1943 dawned, American aircraft production was entering a phase that would make the achievements of 1942 seem modest by comparison. The factories that had struggled to produce 50,000 aircraft annually were preparing to double, then triple their output. Rommel's mockery of American industrial capabilities was about to be answered in the most decisive way possible, not through words or propaganda, but through the overwhelming reality of American aircraft filling the skies over every battlefield where German forces fought. The Desert Fox had awakened something far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The sleeping giant of American industry was stretching its muscles, and the world was about to witness what happened when the full might of American production was focused on a single goal: winning the war. As 1943 began, the transformation of American aircraft production was far from complete. The numbers that had seemed impossible in 1940 were becoming routine by 1942, but even greater achievements lay ahead. The mockery that had greeted Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft announcement was beginning to sound hollow, but the full extent of American industrial capacity was yet to be revealed. Rommel, now fighting a desperate rearguard action across North Africa, was about to witness the true scope of American production power. The Desert Fox, who had dismissed American industrial promises, would soon face the reality of American aircraft production that would exceed even Roosevelt's ambitious goals. What would happen when American factories reached their full potential? How would Germany respond to the growing avalanche of Allied aircraft filling the skies over every battlefield? And what would be the ultimate cost of underestimating the productive capacity of a democratic society united in common cause? The answers to these questions would unfold in the months ahead, as America's aircraft production moved from the merely impressive to the absolutely overwhelming. By January 1943, the transformation of American industry had moved beyond remarkable into the realm of the historically unprecedented. The factories that had struggled to produce 2,000 fighters in 1940 were now delivering that many aircraft every 2 weeks. But even this extraordinary achievement was merely the foundation for what was to come. Erwin Rommel, now commanding Army Group B in France after his defeat in North Africa, was receiving intelligence reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. American aircraft production wasn't just meeting Roosevelt's seemingly impossible goals, it was shattering them. The 50,000 aircraft that Rommel had dismissed as American propaganda in 1940 had become 85,898 aircraft produced in 1943 alone. The Willow Run plant in Michigan had become a symbol of American industrial might that haunted German strategic planning. Henry Ford's promise to build B-24 Liberator bombers on an assembly line had seemed absurd to aviation experts in 1941. Aircraft, they argued, were too complex for mass production techniques. Yet by 1943, Willow Run was producing one 4-engine bomber every hour, 24 hours a day. But it wasn't just bombers. American fighter production had reached levels that fundamentally altered the mathematics of aerial warfare. The P-51 Mustang, which would prove to be the finest fighter aircraft of the war, was rolling off production lines in numbers that exceeded Germany's total fighter output. North American aviation alone was producing more fighters than the entire German aircraft industry. The numbers were staggering and undeniable. In 1943, American factories produced 23,988 fighters, more than double Germany's total fighter production for the same year. This wasn't just quantity over quality. These were aircraft that matched or exceeded German designs in performance while being produced in overwhelming numbers. Behind these numbers were millions of individual stories of transformation and dedication. The workforce that built America's air armada was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Women comprised nearly 40% of aircraft workers by 1943, performing jobs that had been exclusively male just 3 years earlier. Dorothy Miller, a former waitress from Detroit who became a precision machinist at the Packard engine plant, embodied this transformation. I had never touched anything more complicated than a coffee pot, she later recalled. But they taught me to machine engine parts that had to be perfect to within a thousandth of an inch. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The training programs developed to create this workforce were marvels of efficiency. Workers could be taken from complete inexperience to skilled aircraft assembly in as little as 6 weeks. Hollywood studios produced training films that taught complex manufacturing techniques through engaging visual narratives. Industrial engineers developed simplified assembly procedures that allowed relatively unskilled workers to perform tasks that had previously required years of apprenticeship. The diversity of this workforce was unprecedented in American industrial history. African Americans, who had been largely excluded from high-paying industrial work before the war, found opportunities in aircraft plants that transformed their economic prospects. Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants from dozens of countries joined the production lines, creating the most diverse industrial workforce in American history. But the human cost remained significant. Workers suffered from exhaustion, stress-related illnesses, and industrial accidents. The social fabric of communities was strained by rapid population growth and the pressures of wartime production. Yet morale remained remarkably high, sustained by the knowledge that their efforts were directly connected to the survival of American servicemen fighting around the world. From his headquarters in France, Rommel was beginning to comprehend the true scope of his miscalculation. Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front, North Africa, and Italy all told the same story. Allied air power was becoming overwhelming, and American-built aircraft were a major component of that superiority. The Desert Fox, who had built his reputation on tactical innovation and battlefield adaptability, found himself facing a strategic problem that had no tactical solution. No amount of clever maneuvering could compensate for the fundamental imbalance in aircraft production. Germany was being outproduced by a factor of 3 to 1, and the gap was widening every month. Rommel's own experience in North Africa had provided a harsh education in the realities of American industrial power. The Africa Corps, which had dominated the Desert War for nearly 2 years, had been systematically worn down by Allied air attacks. German supply convoys were decimated by American-built fighters and bombers. Luftwaffe units, starved of replacement aircraft and experienced pilots, had been reduced to token forces. The intelligence briefings that crossed Rommel's desk painted an increasingly grim picture. American aircraft were appearing in every theater of the war in numbers that seemed to grow exponentially. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive fighter bomber that could absorb tremendous damage and still return home, was proving devastatingly effective against German ground forces. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, was dominating the skies over Italy and the Mediterranean. Most troubling of all was the P-51 Mustang. German pilots reported that this American fighter was not only produced in vast numbers, but was superior to German aircraft in most performance categories. The Mustang could outfight the Messerschmitt Bf-109, outrun the Focke-Wulf 190, and fly farther than any other single-engine fighter in the world. The impact of American aircraft production extended far beyond simple numbers. The sheer volume of aircraft being produced allowed Allied military planners to contemplate strategies that would have been impossible with smaller air forces. The concept of strategic bombing, using large formations of heavy bombers to destroy enemy industrial capacity, became feasible only because America could produce bombers in sufficient quantities to sustain the inevitable losses. The combined bomber offensive against Germany, launched in earnest in 1943, was a direct result of American industrial capacity. 1,000 bomber raids, which would have been unthinkable in 1940, became routine by 1944. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were being produced in such quantities that the loss of dozens of bombers in a single mission, while tragic, did not significantly impact overall operational capability. For Rommel, tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall against the anticipated Allied invasion, this meant facing an enemy with virtually unlimited air support. German defensive positions could be subjected to continuous bombardment by aircraft that seemed to be replaced faster than they could be shot down. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to Luftwaffe air superiority in the early war years now cowered in bunkers as Allied aircraft roamed freely overhead. The sight of massive bomber formations, escorted by swarms of fighters, became a daily reminder of Germany's industrial inferiority. Rommel understood better than most that modern warfare was as much about production as it was about tactics. His experience in North Africa had taught him that the side with more aircraft, more fuel, and more replacement parts would ultimately prevail, regardless of individual skill or tactical innovation. American aircraft production wasn't just about quantity, it was also driving rapid technological advancement. The pressure to improve performance while maintaining high production rates led to innovations in manufacturing, materials, and design that would have taken decades to develop in peacetime. The P-51 Mustang exemplified this technological evolution. Originally designed to meet a British requirement and powered by an American-built version of the British Merlin engine, the Mustang underwent continuous improvement throughout its production run. Early models were good fighters. Later versions became arguably the finest piston engine fighters ever built. The key was that American production capacity allowed for constant refinement without sacrificing quantity. German aircraft designers, constrained by limited production capacity and material shortages, were forced to choose between quantity and quality. American designers could pursue both simultaneously, leading to aircraft that were both numerous and superior. The B-29 Superfortress represented the pinnacle of this approach. Pressurized, heavily armed, and capable of carrying massive bomb loads over unprecedented distances, the B-29 was more complex than any aircraft previously mass-produced. Yet American industry managed to build over 3,900 of these technological marvels, each one representing a feat of engineering and manufacturing that would have been impossible without the industrial infrastructure created during the war. The effects of American aircraft production extended far beyond any single theater of operations. Under the Lend-Lease program, American-built aircraft were flowing to allies around the world. Britain received thousands of American fighters and bombers, allowing the Royal Air Force to maintain pressure on Germany while rebuilding its own strength. The Soviet Union received over 14,000 American aircraft, including fighters that proved crucial in gaining air superiority on the Eastern Front. This global distribution of American aircraft created a multiplier effect that German planners had not anticipated. Germany was not just facing the full weight of American air power in Western Europe, it was also confronting American-built aircraft on every front where German forces fought. For Rommel, this meant that aircraft that might have been available to support his defensive preparations in France were instead tied down defending Germany itself against strategic bombing or fighting American-supplied aircraft on the Eastern Front. The global scope of American aircraft production had created a strategic situation where Germany was outnumbered on every battlefield simultaneously. By 1944, the cumulative effect of American aircraft production was becoming overwhelming. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 demonstrated the complete transformation of air power since the beginning of the war. Allied forces enjoyed such complete air superiority that German aircraft were virtually absent from the skies over the invasion beaches. Rommel, commanding the German forces defending Normandy, witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of Allied air power. His defensive positions were subjected to continuous bombardment by aircraft that seemed to operate with impunity. German reinforcements attempting to reach the battlefield were decimated by fighter bombers that attacked in relays throughout the day. The Desert Fox, who had once mocked American industrial capabilities, was now experiencing the full weight of American aircraft production. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that strafed his positions were tangible proof that Roosevelt's seemingly impossible promises had not only been fulfilled, but exceeded. In his final letters to his wife, Rommel wrote with bitter recognition of his earlier miscalculation. The enemy's air superiority is crushing. We have no answer to their numbers. Every road, every movement is under constant attack. I fear I underestimated what the Americans could achieve when they set their minds to it. The achievement of American aircraft production came at a cost that extended far beyond the financial. The men and women who built these aircraft worked under conditions of constant pressure and sacrifice. Industrial accidents were common, despite safety programs. Workers suffered from exhaustion and stress-related illnesses. Families were separated as workers migrated to industrial centers, and entire communities were transformed by the demands of wartime production. Rose Williams, who worked at the Bell Aircraft plant in Buffalo, later reflected on those years. We knew we were part of something historic, something that would determine the fate of the world. But we also knew that every day we didn't meet our production quota, American boys were dying somewhere in Europe or the Pacific. That knowledge drove us to work harder than we ever thought possible. The social changes wrought by aircraft production were permanent and far-reaching. Women who had entered the workforce during the war often remained in industrial jobs after 1945, fundamentally altering American society. Minorities who had found opportunities in defense plants used their wartime experience to demand equal treatment in the post-war economy. The technological innovations developed for aircraft production found applications throughout American industry. Manufacturing techniques, quality control methods, and organizational systems developed for wartime production became the foundation for America's post-war economic dominance. When the war ended in May 1945, American aircraft production had reached levels that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. Total wartime production exceeded 300,000 aircraft, including over 100,000 fighters, exactly fulfilling the promise implied in Roosevelt's original announcement, though far exceeding even his ambitious goals. Fighter production alone told the story of American industrial triumph. The 2,141 fighters produced in 1940 had grown to 38,873 in 1944. The P-51 Mustang, which hadn't existed when Rommel first mocked American production goals, was produced in quantities exceeding 15,000 aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, another design that emerged during the war, saw over 15,600 aircraft built. The mockery that had greeted Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft announcement in 1940 had been replaced by awe and respect for American industrial capacity. The democratic society that German leaders had seen as weak and inefficient had demonstrated productive capabilities that redefined what was possible in modern warfare. For Germany, the miscalculation had been catastrophic. The industrial capacity that leaders like Rommel had dismissed as democratic bluster had proven to be the decisive factor in the war. The quality of German aircraft and the skill of German pilots, while formidable, had been overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of American production. Erwin Rommel did not live to see the full extent of his miscalculation. Implicated in the July 20, 1944 plot against Hitler, he was forced to commit suicide in October 1944. But his final months had provided him with a clear understanding of how completely he had underestimated American industrial power. In his last strategic assessments, Rommel acknowledged that Germany's defeat was inevitable, given the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. The Desert Fox, who had built his reputation on tactical brilliance, had learned that in modern warfare, industrial capacity was often more important than battlefield skill. Rommel's miscalculation was shared by virtually the entire German leadership. The Nazi regime, which prided itself on efficiency and organization, had been outproduced by a democratic society that German ideology claimed was inherently inferior. The lesson was clear and devastating. Free societies, when united in common cause, could achieve levels of productivity that authoritarian regimes could not match. As we look back on this remarkable achievement, we must ask ourselves, what made it possible? How did a nation that had struggled to produce 2,000 fighters in 1940 manage to build over 100,000 by the war's end? The answer lies not just in American industrial capacity, but in the character of American society itself. The flexibility, innovation, and determination that had built the railroads, electrified the cities, and mass-produced automobiles proved equally effective when applied to aircraft production. The democratic values that leaders like Rommel had seen as weaknesses, the ability to adapt, to innovate, to mobilize diverse populations for common goals, became America's greatest strengths. Perhaps most importantly, the American people understood what they were fighting for. They were not just building aircraft. They were building the tools of freedom, the instruments of liberation for oppressed peoples around the world. This sense of purpose, combined with American industrial genius, created a force that proved unstoppable. The transformation was so complete that by 1945, American aircraft production capacity exceeded the combined output of all other nations. The sleeping giant that Rommel had underestimated had not only awakened, but had become the dominant industrial power in the world. Erwin Rommel's mockery of American aircraft production goals represents one of history's greatest strategic miscalculations. The Desert Fox, renowned for his tactical brilliance and ability to read the battlefield, had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American society and its industrial potential. The 50,000 fighters that seemed impossible in 1940 became 100,000 by 1945. The democratic society that appeared weak and divided had proven capable of unprecedented unity and productivity when faced with existential threat. The industrial capacity that seemed adequate only for consumer goods had been transformed into the most powerful military production system in human history. In the end, Rommel's greatest miscalculation was not underestimating American industrial capacity. It was underestimating the American spirit. The nation that built 100,000 fighters had proven that free people, united in common cause and driven by shared values, could achieve anything they set their minds to accomplish. The mockery of 1940 had become the miracle of 1945, and the impossible had become inevitable through the combined efforts of millions of Americans who refused to accept that any goal was beyond their reach. The Desert Fox had awakened something far more powerful than he ever imagined: the productive might of a free society determined to preserve freedom for future generations.